Well, a huge welcome to everybody, and thank you so much for giving up your time. As you know, this is going to be a fantastic webinar. We have a fabulous group of individuals, incredibly talented and expert in their field. And we are, of course, here to talk about the topic of sustainability, ESG, and private security. As you know, the risk of doing business is increasingly dangerous, especially in the countries with a weak rule of law. And if you add to that the rising human rights infractions, we really do face a need to address this topic as a matter of urgency, some would argue, which is why today we hope to do two things. One, to highlight the importance of considering private security within ESG, and that's not something that people have typically done. And secondly, to encourage investors to engage more with their portfolio companies, not just by identifying the risks that are associated with the use of private security services, but also with the hope of managing them as well. So big welcome to our speakers in no particular order. Amanda Young, Chief Sustainability Officer for Aberdeen. Chris Galvin, Head of Outreach, International Code of Conduct Association, and you'll notice throughout that we just call it ICOCA for short. Rebecca De Winter-Schmidt, Associate Director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, and Helen Grifton, Human Rights and Social Impact Lead for BP. So fantastic group. And I will say for those online, please do pop your questions in the chat at any time. We will leave time for questions at the end. And of course, if we spot any as we go through, we will try and incorporate them as well. So let's start with Chris. Chris, last time we spoke, which was only last week, you were in Basra. So can you please tell us a bit about what you do? People have the image of private security as border guards, and I think it's really important that we all have a similar understanding of what is private security, and maybe just touch on the size and the scale of the problem.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Nuala. And now back in Geneva, but yes, I was in Basra in southern Iraq last week, meeting with various stakeholders, including ICOCA companies and their clients. And I met, for example, some of Helen's colleagues at BP and with civil society organizations. It was actually because of the actions of one or two international private security companies operating in Iraq back in the 2000s that actually led to the development of the International Code of Conduct in 2010, and then to the founding of ICOCA a few years later in 2013. The association ICOCA, it's a multi-stakeholder association that acts as the governance and oversight mechanism of the code. When companies join ICOCA, they agree to be monitored by the association and to report to us on an annual basis on a range of kind of code-related indicators. The code itself lays out principles and commitments for private security companies based on existing human rights law and international humanitarian law. And at the time that the code was developed, there was really no regulation of the industry. And some companies were seen to be kind of flagrantly violating basic human rights, including the right to life. So while private security isn't a new phenomenon, what was new in Iraq back then, and increasingly in many countries around the world since then, is really the growth of the sector. So the size and scale of the industry now is immense, and its services are utilized by pretty much every industry and sector. If you think of, for example, the last time you went to an office building or a public building, there were probably private security posted there. Think of the last time you went to the airport through security, there's a good chance that the people doing the airport security screening were actually private security personnel. In many of the countries where ICOCA is particularly focused, the private security sector, is actually the largest employer of any industry or sector. So to put that in a little bit of context for you, a few months ago, I was in Tanzania, for example, and there are now over 2,000 security companies operating in the country and over 1 million people employed in the sector there. If you take one company, Allied Universal, which is the largest private security company in the world now, I think it's got around about 800,000 employees, making it one of the largest organizations in terms of numbers of employees in the world. So it really is a huge sector. The growth is being driven by the privatization of security in many parts of the world. These private security companies provide a whole range of services, both armed and unarmed, from static and mobile guarding of people and assets. So in South Somalia, in the oil fields of Basra, for example, where BP operate, it's a pretty volatile environment, can be, and at any one time, and there's about 20,000 people working on the oil field using some pretty expensive equipment, and that all needs security. But as well as guarding, security companies can offer risk management services. We do maritime, so counter piracy services, maritime escorts, onboard vessel protection, operational and logistical support for armed and security forces, and lots more. What's critical to note, however, is that private security personnel are civilians. They are not military personnel, and they are not and should not be involved in offensive military operations. Certainly no ICOCA companies should be in that line of business. So I hope that gives you a kind of a sense of the way that the industry's exploded over the last decade, and especially in some kind of fragile contexts, as you mentioned, with kind of weak rule of law where the regulation can actually be non-existent, and therefore the risks for abuse can be huge. It's also gone from being a very high margin industry where people made a lot of money during the Iraq War, for example, to being now a highly competitive, very low margin business with companies undercutting each other to win the business. And one problem when you cut costs is that you cut corners. And in the private security sector, that means people aren't properly vetted, they're not properly trained, and they are put in positions of power, but often themselves treated very poorly by their employers. And so the risks for abuse are really enormous. I mean, it's well known that when you abuse people, they go on and commit abuse themselves. So that's all I'll say for now. It's a huge sector. There's major risk.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. It's fabulously interesting, and I really do think that people don't have a hand. We don't think about it. It's just not something that people pass their minds to as regularly. It's just not salient, I think, in people's minds, which I guess is why we're here, and also why we're looking at the investors in particular. So, to consider whether investors are aware of this. I mean, obviously, their job is to examine companies end to end right through the value chain. So, Rebecca, just this focuses industry-wide, if you like. From your experience with the investment industry, the Alliance seeks to ensure that investors respect human rights, and I think most investors would say that they do. But when their companies are utilising private security, tell us a bit about the mission of the Alliance firstly, and also your experience of the key risks that are faced by investors when their companies do utilise private security.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Nuala. Thanks for that question. And just thanks to all the panelists today and to all of those who are listening in. Really pleased this webinar is happening because I think it is indeed a problem that often flies under the radar despite the prevalence of this industry. Just briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, we're actually a collective action platform for responsible investment that is grounded in respect for people's fundamental rights as laid out in international business and human rights frameworks. We are a membership-based initiative focusing on three things: the investor responsibility to respect human rights, corporate engagements that drive responsible business conduct, as well as standard setting and policymaking activities that push for robust business and human rights governance. Our membership is currently comprised of over 240 institutional investors, to include Aberdeen, and they represent a total of over 14 trillion in assets under management and are headquartered in 21 different countries. But to get to your question specifically about the risks to investors, in particular when portfolio companies utilize private security in a fashion that's not necessarily responsible. And I think what we see is that from those risks that are related to the kind of impacts that those private security providers can have, things that Chris just mentioned, whether it be in terms of poor working conditions or it be with regards to how force might be utilized, those risks cause then certain types of operational disruptions, potentially customer boycotts, reputational damage, loss of the social license to operate, have potentially negative impacts on conflict dynamics, could lead to legal action against private security companies and their clients. And all of these in turn flow down as risks to investors themselves, right? Because it affects not only long-term value creation, but also short-term share prices of portfolio companies, which of course will then threaten investment returns. And of course, as financial fiduciaries, institutional investors, be they pension fund trustees, or be they investment managers, they're obligated to identify and mitigate those potential and actual adverse impacts. But beyond the material risks that are posed to investors, we see a number of investors that self-identify as responsible investors that pursue sustainable investment practices. They may offer ESG designated investment funds. They need to control the social and human rights impacts that are associated with the use of private security providers by their portfolio companies, because it's very much an imperative for their own reputation and for their own credibility. And I think that's the way that investors kind of have an in into this issue that really makes it very relevant for how they do business.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks very much. And I think you've given us a very nice in to Amanda, where now the spotlight's really going to turn on as representing the investors. What do you think, Amanda? I mean, you've heard from Chris and Rebecca. I mean, in your work, you research how companies do pose human rights risk, as you do. The area of private securities is less covered. So do you think two things? Do you think fund managers are actually aware of when their portfolio companies actually contract these private security companies? That's firstly, are they aware of that? And then secondly, how familiar do you think they are in terms of the ESG related risks in this space?
Thanks, Nuala, and it's great to be with everybody here today. So first is, if they're not aware, they should be aware, because as Rebecca's already highlighted, your supply chain, in whatever guise it is, your suppliers, your contractors, they are all material for the businesses that you're running. So if investors are not aware, they're clearly not doing their job very well. But what I would say is that perhaps there hasn't been as much focus on this particular issue in more recent years than historically there has been. And that might be for a number of different reasons. A lot of our clients, the asset owners, are focusing on things like climate change and natural capital, and social issues are often the sort of poor child of, sister of ESG in many respects. But there are two areas that investors really need to be thinking about. A, investing in any company that might already be offering these types of services, and there are listed companies that offer private security services. And the second, which I think is the bigger risk, are companies operating particularly in countries with weak rule of law that are outsourcing security to private security firms. And that, as Rebecca has already highlighted, can pose major risks. There are these are issues that I know our portfolio managers and analysts have spoken to companies about in recent years, but it doesn't tend to be one of those issues that you will pick and then go out to speak to a range of individual companies. It's probably very much on a case by case. I would also say that perhaps the focus is waned over recent years because companies have become more acutely aware of their need to manage security within their businesses. It's much harder to hide your operations than historically 10, 15 years ago in terms of your supply chain. So I'd like to think that perhaps corporate behavior has improved somewhat, which has meant that we've had to focus on these areas less, but they do remain a key risk for investors. And investment managers should be aware of the companies that they're operating, where they operate, the rule of law in the countries that these companies are operating in, and the need for private security, A, to protect their staff, B, to protect their assets. But they need to be very acutely aware of the behavior of these companies has on the communities in which they find themselves operating.
That's a great point, Amanda. And actually, you've touched on something that was in the FT only last week, in which there was a full article on the fact that they thought that the whole area of ESG was actually waning and had decreased in focus, at the expense of other things. So it really pointed a bit of a dismal picture, to be fair. So interesting to bear that in mind also as a backdrop. move to Helen now, who actually does engage at the coalface. And Helen, we'd love to get your perspective on this, because private security can be seen as marginal, and not many companies do connect it to either ESG or human rights, as Chris and the others have just pointed out. So although BP isn't an investment company, as we know, and you do utilize private security, and you have taken active steps to manage these human rights risks. Can you maybe just tell us a little bit about these, and maybe define in your mind what you think good looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Amanda makes a good point. We have typically across industry and across companies got better at talking about these risks, and as such got better at having acknowledged them, at managing them. But I think it's really important that having got to a place where we are perhaps managing them better in many cases, we don't let them slip down the priority list, because this is something that's an evolving risk, and the geopolitical situation can change and immediately change how we manage or should be managing that particular risk posed. I think talking about recognizing the risk is absolutely critical. So, for instance, our organization, and I know a number of others, has got a security and human rights lead. So pulling the two together, recognizing that the risk is there and charging someone with making sure that they are managing it. And that's reaching out to both public and private security providers, civil society, across governments where we're operating, both in host and home governments. And it's important that that individual has suitable credibility across all of those various stakeholders. I think, as with pretty much anything in this area, a lot of success comes down to having practical conversations, ongoing dialogue with your providers. So making sure that you are engaging, having regular conversations with your private security providers, understanding their capability or where they may have capability gaps, and also making very clear what your expectations are as a user about where their lines of authority start and stop. And also in particular, where there might be a requirement for them to engage with public security forces, where those delineations are, and making sure that everyone is very clear on their areas of responsibility to start off with. And that can be very simply put down to things like contract clauses put into contracts. But I think we all know that the real rubber hits the road when it comes to conversations, working together closely, and a real mutual understanding between private security and the companies they're working for. I think in terms of best practice, pointing organisations who might not be members of ICOCA in the direction of ICOCA. Chris, very comprehensively gave an idea of the scale of the industry. So whilst we probably can't punt all in the direction of membership, there are some very useful tools, there's some very useful guidance, and an awful lot of support available to organisations. And it certainly helps us as a company if we can look to someone who is a member of ICOCA and know that they are being provided with certain parameters under which they should be operating as a member. And I think, coming down to the absolute basics on that relationship piece, Chris touched on the numerous challenges in the private security industry in terms of payment. We should be engaging as corporates and making sure that those individuals operating at our sites are being treated in a way that is appropriate to their worker rights, never mind the broader rights of the communities. And we have to make sure that they're being paid enough, accommodated appropriately, fed appropriately when they're out on shifts, because that's the absolute baseline of making sure that people are able to operate effectively and in a way that won't then have a knock-on effect in a negative way. So that's high level, very quick canter through my idea of what good practice looks like, but those would be my key tenets to start off with.
Well, they're terrific, Helen. And if I could just ask you one question on this, you mentioned the contract clauses. Do you mandate that some of the suppliers are a member of ICOCA? I know other companies do. Is that something that you would suggest as being a good step in the right direction, maybe? It is.
It's a step in the right direction, and I know ICOCA and we've engaged on this one on numerous occasions. We strongly believe that ICOCA membership is preferable and is something we would like to see, but we're also very conscious that there are times when we are engaging with smaller local organisations who haven't yet had the opportunity to become a member of ICOCA. It might be that they haven't heard about them, and we wouldn't want to exclude that local content opportunity from bidding for work with our organisation from a community perspective by mandating ICOCA membership, but we can certainly always propose it as preferable or something that we would like to see them move in the direction of. And that's why we haven't mandated to this point membership, but we do flag strongly and work closely with ICOCA as part as well of our membership of the Voluntary Principles Initiative to flag that as preferable.
Great, and of course, Chris, we'd be interested to hear your view on that, and also maybe in terms of what has motivated, because you have a broad, you operate across a number of different of these industries, and why are you now focusing on investors? Maybe just give us a quick sense of why that, and how you think you can ensure what you can do beyond what I think Helen might have pointed to ensure that the private security firms actually adhere to more ethical practices. Because as you say, it's not easy in the field. And I see some questions are coming in here as well, so I'll take a look at those as well. But maybe if you wouldn't mind answering that one first.
Yeah, no, sure. And just to pick up on Helen's point then, I'll use the example of Southern Iraq. So, you know, I was in Basra last week, and what we're seeing through oil and gas companies referencing ICOCA in tenders there is it's driving the market, it's driving standards up in the sector. So there are, for example, 10 local Basra-based security companies that have joined the association, and that's all driven because clients in the oil and gas sector are requiring this. We as an organization can tell a security company till we're kind of blue in the face to join, but really they're commercial organizations, and there's got to be that commercial incentive, and that comes from clients, which is, you know, why it's so important that we're having this conversation. In terms of, you know, what motivated us to focus on investors, I mean, the simple answer is that we haven't seen enough uptake of the standard by companies contracting private security providers. I mean, I mentioned before that private security is used across all industries and sectors, but we're not seeing requirements for ICOCA in many of them. Actually, the extractives, oil, gas, mining, they've been ahead of the curve thanks to things like voluntary principles. Especially, you know, large multinationals who really should be on top of this issue, we're still not seeing enough requirements. And so the reason for engaging investors is because we believe that investors can influence their portfolio companies, hopefully, to do the right thing, and we want to help investors ask the right questions when in those investor meetings. We want to build their awareness. I mean, that's part of the reason, obviously, why we're doing this event today, and we want to build awareness that this actually does represent real risk for them, but that they can influence these companies to ensure better human rights due diligence is really being conducted on the supply chain. We do also want to grow investor awareness about the fact that this issue cuts across all regions, industries, and sectors. And so I've mentioned that, you know, oil, gas extractives, who people traditionally kind of, you know, think of as being private security users, and they are, but everybody uses them. So to give you one recent example, I'm not going to kind of mention any names. We're not here to name and shame, but, you know, supermarket shelves across Europe and beyond are stacked with the products of one famous food company that I'm not going to name, including the pineapples that they produce. Late last year, there was a series of allegations of abuse by private security personnel that came to light concerning the largest supplier of pineapples to the company in Kenya. I'll just add, by the way, that private security guards in Kenya are not allowed to carry firearms. And so there's this kind of assumption that this is only relevant where security are carrying guns. That is not the case. Use of force can be, and misuse of force can be with non-lethal weapons as well. But investors in both the food company and the supermarkets that they supply, they've got an interest in making sure that these kind of incidents don't happen again, because the reputational damage, it can be severe. Both for the portfolio company and for their investors who've got that financial and reputational risk. So we want to make this simple for investors and for their portfolio companies. There's a simple way, obviously, we would say, for them to do this and for them to be assured that the human rights due diligence on security providers is being conducted, and that's to require that these companies join ICOCA or have a policy of only contracting ICOCA certified companies. The certification that we do, it really provides assurance that the private security company that holds that certification is operating responsibly, is adhering to ethical practices, for example, is properly vetting and training its personnel. Those personnel are insured, they're paid a fair wage, they're paid on time. We look and make sure the owners of the company don't have a record of human rights abuse themselves. We look to make sure that the policies and procedures are in place, that they have a grievance mechanism, that they're conducting human rights impact assessments, all of these things and many more. In fact, we've got a list of about 550 indicators that we look at when we do our due diligence. And so it's a rigorous process, and it's something investors and users of private security services can kind of find assurance in. It's not to say that things can't go wrong. You can never completely eliminate risk, but this is certainly a way to reduce it.
Fabulous, Chris. And I think you must have seen some of these questions, because there were a lot of the first couple of questions were all about certification and whether whether there are any requirements around ISO or any of the others, the other type of certifications that you can have. So I think you've answered a couple of those. So one qualification for somebody, we will go, but there's some questions in from different people about West Africa, and there was a question about Australia. But just if you wouldn't mind clarifying for 1 minute, how does ICOCA and the Code of Conduct differ from voluntary principles on security and human rights, just in case people are wondering about that? That's from Hope, a question from Hope.
Sure, yeah. So the big difference is that the voluntary principles, the corporate pillar, as it were, are the likes of BP. It's the users of private security and public security. Our corporate members are the private security providers themselves. We don't focus on public security. That is another difference. And then I would say the other major difference is really comes to the kind of third-party verification and certification. And so ICOCA works with a select number of certification bodies who go in and do third-party audits on companies. So to become ICOCA certified, you've got to attain one of currently 3 standards that we recognize. You've got to attain that certification through a certification body that we recognize. And then we use those 500 plus indicators to look on top of that, are they human rights compliant? And so it's a very in-depth, rigorous kind of verification process, which differs quite a bit from the voluntary principles.
Fabulous, of course. Many thanks for that. And actually, there is a question for Helen, which I will ask in a moment. But maybe first, Helen, do you think, because you're at the coalface with this as well, is this an issue that companies are engaging their investment managers? So in your company, do you speak to investment managers about this, or do you speak to HR or the CSR teams about this topic? So who's your port of call? So who is your audience when you're trying to convince them about the importance of this topic?
Sorry, taking a while to come off mute there. I think for us, the business case is made. So I'm not really having to do an internal sales pitch on the importance of this topic, hence having a role that focuses on human rights and security. We work hand in glove together. That was my role before. I now sit in the sort of strategy team at BP, running human rights across the whole global estate. So that business case isn't required in our organization. I think you ask a good question about how much we engage with our investor teams on this, and I think probably the answer is not enough, and it's one I will be taking forward from this conversation, to have build those relationships and be almost prompting the questions backwards and forwards between our investors to ensure that we're almost on a capability build with our investment teams as well, to make sure that this is something they can talk about intelligently if asked. We work very closely with our broader community and communications teams across the security and human rights piece, and making sure that we're talking all the way down to community level on this as a topic, and making sure that, Chris touched on grievance mechanisms, there is an understanding all the way back up to the central point as well, that where a grievance is raised relating to this sort of thing, that it comes to the right people in the organization, there's enough understanding for it to be tackled appropriately by the right teams, by people who understand the risks and issues.
Great. And just, Helen, while you're there, And there's a question for you about BP, whether BP typically, I guess, analyzes and reports on these risks. So it's associated with the violations of humanitarian law by the private security providers and national security forces. And the example is Nagorno-Karabakh.
Yeah, and I think there's probably a slight agenda behind that question specifically, and from an anonymous requester. So particularly referencing Nagorno-Karabakh, I will say that, of course, we look at all of our providers, both public and private security providers, and engage on where there have been violations. We operate transparently across that within the Voluntary Principles Initiative. That's one of the key tenets of membership, and we tackle those issues on a case-by-case basis and on a site-by-site and sort of country-by-country basis. So yes, we absolutely are always looking at those risks, the issues and challenges that may arise as a result of our operations from a private and public security standpoint.
Okay, great. And thanks for that. And Amanda, let's go back to you for a minute. In terms of the conversations that you have with companies, has the topic of private security come up from them? Now, it may not come up at all, but is this a topic that they even talk about in your conversations, or even if you were to go back to them now and raise this, how surprised do you think they would be that, Aberdeen was interested in this space and something that you were, actively looking at? Would it be a surprise to them? And is it a surprise to you?
Most multinational extractive companies will now be all over this and will have had conversations with investors. I mean, when I set out in responsible investment 25 years ago, raising these issues with companies was a surprise to them, but it's probably not a surprise anymore. BP has already talked about, Helen's already talked about how BP, she doesn't have to win the case internally. And I think all the big, large multinationals in the extractive industries that are operating in countries with weak rule of law that require quite tight security, or even through using security services. I mean, I know this is about private security rather than public, but there are companies that have to use the government-based security services, and that in itself becomes another whole can of worms and can be quite difficult. I think Chris has made a very valid point that private security is not just the preserve of what we would say were the obvious companies exposed to this, and that actually private security in developed market countries is probably less of a focus for investors. And that might be a surprise for some companies if you start asking them about their supply chains. But supply chain conversations have happened for many years with companies, touching from raw material use to slave labor and potential modern slavery in supply chains. But this in itself is a really interesting area, and Chris is touching upon supermarkets that get food supply and where the private security fits along that chain of delivery. And I think that there are probably fewer questions on the less obvious companies when it comes to this. And I mean, they shouldn't be surprised, because investors ask them all types of things about how they operate, and supply chain has definitely been on company agenda. You probably find that there's a size bias as well. So those companies that are very big global companies that have multi-global operations, where this is more obvious, will be on top of these issues, rather than smaller companies that might be more surprised if investors ask them questions on this.
Yeah, it's a great point. And actually, let's bring in Rebecca. Rebecca, do you think that, based on what you've just heard, do you think that the solution, so looking ahead for some solutions, do you think solution requires more carrot than stick? And then I'd be interested, Amanda, in your take on this one as well. Rebecca, if you pop off mute.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think it definitely has to be a bit of both. It's not going to be either or. I mean, I think, in terms of getting private security providers, the clients, and even the investors themselves to do the due diligence in terms of identifying and addressing the risks that are linked to the use of private security, you're going to need, on the one hand, kind of that enlightened self-interest, which is what we've talked about here, that it just simply makes business sense. I mean, it's kind of, in some level, it's unfathomable that you wouldn't seek to proactively identify and address risks linked to the use of private security. And we understand the financial impacts. I think Chris is going to show us some data just in a little bit about what, failure to adequately, ensure that there's responsible use of private security can have tremendous impact financially. So, there's that enlightened self-interest, which I think is the carrot in of itself. But then there's also, I guess, in some sense, the stick is that inevitably you also need to have adequate laws and regulations in place that ensure that when there are human rights harms, there is going to be, adequate enforcement of those laws and regulations and accountability if need be for perpetrators. And I think, we already see a trend that is pretty irreversible right now. There are an increasing number of laws in the EU and elsewhere that are requiring better corporate disclosures around their social and environmental impacts, that are requiring companies to undertake the necessary human rights and environmental due diligence to understand and manage their risks. There may be some occasional setbacks, for those in the European context. We know that the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that is meant to mandate human rights and environmental due diligence is really hanging in the fold right now. We'll see what happens this week. But irrespective of those occasional setbacks, there is a trend. Everywhere we're seeing more, corporate disclosures being required, be it, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU, be it the fact that in the US, the SEC just released their climate disclosures. There's certain countries that already have due diligence laws on the books, like France and Germany. So that's not going to change. So, but that said, smart mix, a bit of both. It makes just good business sense. And there's also increasingly a regulatory case that's demanding this of companies.
What I say to add to Rebecca's points, Nuala, that you asked, is that actually what we would want as investors not to have a box ticking exercise. And this is actually where ICOCA actually can provide a really good framework and some independent due diligence, if you like, for investors. So if companies are signing up to certain standards that require them to operate in a certain way, it does give us as investors quite a lot of assurance around that. But we tend to look at things case by case. So it's quite difficult for something like security to be measured in the same way as you would climate change, where you can look at quite hard data when it comes to carbon emissions. And then, yes, you have to look at companies' climate plans and transition plans. But ultimately, every single company is going to be using private security in a different way, even if they're in the same sector, because where they operate and what they are doing can differ quite considerably.
That's great. Thanks, Amanda. And sorry, Rebecca, you were going to add in?
Yes, I just wanted to jump because there's also a question that came up with regards to ESG data that Amanda was just touching on. I mean, I think one thing that investors need is better ESG data. Unfortunately, a lot of the big data providers that investors are inevitably very dependent upon, because they hold hundreds, if not thousands, of companies in their portfolios and can't possibly do a deep dive on every single company. You need that kind of consolidated good data that allows, for comparability and an understanding of corporate performance over time. The problem is, traditionally, as Amanda said, the S in the ESG has been relatively neglected, and there just isn't good data out there in terms of companies' human rights impacts. And there's been, a lot of studies done showing some of the shortcomings, with regards to inconsistent or non-transparent methodologies in terms of how data is being collected, a heavy reliance on company self-reporting. You'll see oftentimes that there is a tendency to examine the policies and processes companies have in place, not their actual impact on human rights situations. There's a lot of good data out there that's coming from academic institutes, from civil society organizations, from benchmarking initiatives that just doesn't get incorporated. And frankly, and with the kind of ESG backlash that's going on, I think particularly maybe more so in the United States than elsewhere, although having global repercussions, there's a pressure on ESG data providers not to engage in what's then viewed to be political causes, rather than responsible business practices. So all of this has led to a dearth of data, but there are some initiatives that are coming out that are seeking to address this. There's a new initiative being launched for investors on it's called the Investor Initiative on Human Rights Data that will hopefully close some of these gaps. WikiRate has just recently started a project on open ESG data in the finance sector. So it's something I think everyone's very aware of. We just don't have that data in hand yet, and to include data that in particular addresses any kind of potential gaps or shortcomings companies might have with regards to responsible use of security provision. But I agree with what was said so far, that certainly for investors a very convenient shorthand when making investment decisions and trying to understand what companies are using security responsibly is to make sure that security providers, private security providers, are part of ICOCA, because that they're requiring due diligence.
Yeah, super, Rebecca. Thanks. I'm going to pause for a minute because there are a lot of questions coming in, and we can take some of them now. I think to answer the ICOCA one, and certification, just one quick question for you, Chris, and from Eugene. Has there been to date an initiative to certify to ISO and ICOCA simultaneously? I think the answer is no. Maybe if you just wouldn't mind clarifying that before we go on to Lisa.
So the way ICOCA certification works is that you have to attain one of the 3 standards that we currently recognize. 2 of those are ISOs. 18788 is the most common standard. 28007 is a maritime standard. So you have to attain those through a certification body we recognize, and then we do our certification on top of that, looking at the human rights elements. Now, there is within the articles, companies can approach us if they want other standards to be recognized, and so there is a process whereby the board and the association can consider other standards. So it's a dynamic thing. Some of these standards are, very common in some markets, and some are not used at all in others. And so, these things evolve, and we have to kind of stay on top of it.
Thank you very much. Lisa Nathan has a question. Interested to understand investor stewardship. Has this focused on private security firms themselves or the client companies? And then she asks a question: for engaging with private security firms, how does a large number of non-publicly listed companies in the private security sector impact on the role investors play? And I know, so that's a question. And then I know the second half we are going to pick up about a question for Rebecca in a couple of minutes about due diligence frameworks and legislation. So we park the second half for a few minutes, and maybe just who would like to answer that question? So how does a large number of non-publicly listed companies in the private security sector impact on the role investors play? Quite a hard question. I'm going to pick Amanda.
A good thing I just came off mute, Nuala. Thank you. So I think public or private, it doesn't really make much difference, because many of the public companies that you are investing in are using the private companies. So we can't engage with those private companies in terms of how they are operating. But if the public companies that are using those are demanding higher standards in order to protect their own reputation, you've got some influence through the public listed sectors. And I think that's the really important thing, is that supply chain piece. And what we've seen as investors is regulation coming down the line, such as modern slavery statements and things like that, expecting companies to be far more acutely aware of their supply chains. But at the same time, they need to be acutely aware of who they partner with in order to provide services that keep their staff safe, their operations safe, etc. So I think that we as investors have, unless we are private equity investors invested in a private security company, where you probably have a stronger voice, to be honest, because in the private equity space, you tend to own larger chunks of those companies. And so that voice can be quite useful in terms of ensuring strong governance and the right policies. But those companies that have no investors, that are entirely privately owned, they are still reliant on public companies as clients, and that's where our voice would come to fore.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Thanks. And I know, Chris, you seem to be typing an answer to the question about West Africa leverage for banditry and armed groups menace. I see Chris is typing an answer. I'm not sure. Somebody must be typing an answer for that.
Actually, I wasn't, but I will just mention
Okay.
on this because and this is kind of a little tangential to the question, but West Africa, obviously, we've seen another kind of rising spectre of private military and security companies, particularly Russian, the Wagner Group. And that adds a whole nother kind of complicated dynamic, certainly to the equation in that region. I just want to be clear that we, as an association, do not work with private military companies. Wagner is not a member of ICOCA. But in that region, yeah, this is causing real issues. There are major security issues, and some of the government's regimes have turned to Wagner because of some of the issues that are raised in that question.
Okay, great, Chris. And I am going to come back to you on something about the treatment and the working conditions, because I think you have an excellent example that you're going to share with us in a moment. But maybe firstly, we'll just take the question from Isabel. I feel she's been patiently has asked that question a while back, and I don't want to lose it on her. So from Vancouver, Canada, question about Australian being criticised for their actions on private security companies engaged with the oversight of refugees on Nauru Island. Now, I don't know if you know about this or not. Maybe people on the panel know or don't know about this. If you don't know about it, that's fine. But anyway, multiple human rights issues were raised by the international civil society community, in particular, private security risks and mismanagement. The question is, how can companies not only improve their awareness and practices of human rights when working with these services, but also look at such issues from a governance opportunity and then open from G. So even though this is a particular issue for refugees on Nauru Island, I think the principle is probably the same more broadly. So who would like to take that question?
I mean, I can.
Feels like Chris.
I mean, I can make one response. Maybe Rebecca is going to step in as well. But this is certainly an area where, I mean, I kind of rattled off some of the services that security providers are involved with, and migration detention centers is absolutely one. And this is a really controversial area because of exactly some very high-profile problematic issues that have happened. Now, interestingly, when you talk to, and I'm not talking necessarily about this Canadian company, but when you talk to some of the providers that have been involved in this, then their response is also that the government plays a critical role here because essentially they're being brought in, and these centers are ramped up with no notice. They have to get people in, the next day. How do you train people? How do you recruit them? The level of provision is not at the level that you need for the centers, and so it's the responsibility is obviously with the security provider, but it's also with the contracting organization, in this case often with governments. It's a very challenging, problematic area. It's actually something that we are conducting kind of research on at the moment, so we're hoping to be able to shed more light on this in the months and years ahead.
Fantastic. Chris, I just want you to share with the group, if you would, consequences, given this is an investment topic, consequences of what happens when investors do not pay enough attention to this whole area around the use of force, treatment of private security personnel, and these working conditions which compound abuse. It is a material risk. It is a reputational risk to investors. So maybe you could just give us a couple of minutes of the actual material impact that this has on companies.
Yeah, so I'll just show you one kind of example to illustrate this, and if we can pop it up on the screen, Florrie. So the example I like to kind of show is this of Tahoe Resources, which it was a Canadian mining company with operations in Guatemala, and so they had it's called the Escobal mine, which at the time was the world's second largest silver mine. And as is unfortunately often the case with mining companies, they saw significant conflict between the mine and the surrounding community. They didn't go about the kind of community engagement when the mine was set up as they should. The security providers were put in the middle of this conflict, and their response was basically to arm up and use force. And ultimately, it's led to lots of serious injuries and people being killed. And it played out very publicly in a series of court cases in Guatemala. The company was essentially suspended. There were several pension funds that divested due to the human rights concerns, and essentially they were bought out for a fraction of their price. So any investor that had bought stock at that peak there seriously lost out. The upside, and this is why I like to tell this story, is that we are now working very closely with the company that bought out Tahoe Resources, and they have introduced an ICOCA requirement certification as a requirement for their security providers, and it is working. And at that site, the situation now compared to 10 years ago is really, really significantly improved. And that one company, by introducing that requirement, is actually driving up the market across Latin America.
Terrific, Chris. Thanks very much for that. And you've had a couple of responses. Just a very quick question while you're there. It's somebody, where is it? In terms of, oh yeah, sorry, very quickly. Once you certify as an ICOCA member, are you reassessed after a certain period? I know the answer is yes. And what's the period?
Yes, after 3 years.
3 years. Okay, thanks.
I did want to just kind of follow up on one comment from Amanda as well, and she's mentioned climate change a couple of times, and it links to mining and this whole kind of siloing of E, S, and G, and we're kind of assuming here that we're talking about the S for social or security, as we like to say, but if we take climate change and the energy transition that is required, then security is going to be absolutely critical for the kind of mineral extraction that has got to take place. And that mineral extraction is going to take place in many, many, many fragile contexts around the world. And so if you look at renewable energy, for example, wind, solar companies, any company that essentially requires land and access to land and resources, there is the potential to come into conflict with the communities there. And so if you don't do this responsibly, then we're going to have a major, major problem in our hands, because the scale of resource extraction that is required for the energy transition is absolutely unbelievable. So yeah, I think taking these siloed ES and G as separate I think we have to see this a bit more holistically.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. Conscious of the clock, we have 7 minutes left. I want to move to Rebecca. Rebecca, there has been an ICOCA procurement guide developed. We worked on it last year. I'd love you to just give just a very quick overview of some of the actions that people can practically take. And I think Hope has made the comment about, that the security workers themselves are vulnerable to exploitation, which I think is actually right. But this might address Tatiana's question about the due diligence process. So if you wouldn't mind, just give us a quick overview.
Exactly. I'm just going to ask quickly. So what Florrie's flashing up on the screen right now is the Investor ESG Guide on Private Security and Human Rights that was developed by us together with ICOCA and ENACT, came out last fall. And if you go to the next slide, just very briefly, because we're not going to have time to go through all of these, let me just tell you what this guide aims to do. It has two purposes. The first is to increase awareness of the human rights risks associated with investments in companies that utilize private security providers, everything from the workers' rights issues to use of force issues to gender discrimination and beyond. And then secondly, to support investors in addressing the risks throughout the investment life cycle. And these are the 10 recommended actions, as you can see, that track through from investment screening to investment selection to responsible stewardship. That came up as a question as well as if needed, as a last resort, responsible divestment. I should say, This guide underpinning it are important international business and human rights frameworks like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines, both of which outlay a very detailed due diligence process that's needed for companies and investors to effectively identify and address their human rights related risks. And I don't want to go through all of this. I just want to say maybe just a few words to each, to the extent that, it's very important early on for investors to effectively communicate to portfolio companies what their expectations are around the responsible use of private security. Also to very much understand where the risks lie. We already discussed this today. There's certain sectors, there's certain types of security services that are being provided. There's certain geographies that pose higher risk than others. So to be aware of that, in terms of investment selection, to have a good understanding of what is the ability of your portfolio company to effectively oversee and manage its private security providers. Do they know what to look for in terms of good, for example, processes to address serious incidents when they occur? Do they have good processes in terms of how they procure private security, how they train their employees, and that sort of thing? Of course, a very important role, Amanda and others have discussed this, of stewardship. Investors have that access to the portfolio companies who use security. Talk to them, understand what they're doing in terms of regularly monitoring how that security is being used, what kind of leverage that portfolio company might be trying to exercise over its private security provider when a harm occurs, to remediate that harm. And then, of course, as a last resort, if there's harm that's caused, it's not being effectively addressed and mitigated, how does one exit the situation responsibly? So I don't want to say too much. I think Floria's going to pop the link to the guide in the I guess Q&A function, and I would really encourage everyone to take a look at it, and to also feel free to reach out to investors, in particular reach out to ICOCA. I know that Chris and his team are prepared to answer any questions about how to implement the guide, or more broadly, just in terms of what investors can do to ensure that there's good use of responsible security. Thanks.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I would just also add that there is actually an excellent procurement guide as well that people can pass to members of their team as well. It's a fantastic, very helpful and very useful for a lot of teams. So it is something that can be taken. It's not the same as the investor guide, obviously, but it is something that can be used and is incredibly valuable. Okay, so we're on to the last 2 minutes. So let's move just very quickly to Amanda and Helen. You've just heard quite a lot of examples, quite a lot of suggestions. In terms of what we can do going forward. Which of these do you think are most realistic? And I know that people have been there are one or two more questions, and we'll try and get one or two of these last ones in as well. But from what you've heard, what do you think is most realistic? Let's start with Helen.
Yeah, absolutely. I will also say that I have been attempting to type answers to the questions that I can in the question box. So if people want to go and check, I may have answered your question as we've been going. I think from my perspective, an awful lot of the engagement that we need to do internally involves almost a push on education towards our investor teams to then push that out into investors, because it's not simply our organization that needs investors to be aware of this situation. It is more generally. And if we can be part of that education component, as an organization who is aware of the risk, who works with multiple organizations, and I think that's something that is beholden on us to start that conversation. Clearly interested in Rebecca and Amanda's responses to that. Do you want the push from companies like ours as well? But that would be a takeaway for me from today.
Super.
And from my perspective, I think there's a couple of things that are realistic. The fact that we have got ICOCA, we should be encouraging companies to push people in that direction, because that gives you assurance of things, it does a lot of the work that you for you. So I think that's an easy ask as investors. And using a framework like the Investor Alliance for Human Rights framework, so in terms of your engagement practices, I think is another very simple and easy to apply action as an investor. The one thing we didn't touch on, and we talk about, if you use security companies to the companies that we're investing in, that's fine, because you've already got there. But to Chris's point, that actually we may see an increase in the use of security companies, maybe from companies who've never really gone down that route historically, is actually really digging into, if they're going to be doing that, what standards are they going to be putting in place? And the other point that, as I said, we didn't touch on, is that free, prior and informed consent. because if companies can try and minimize the need for security companies right from the off when they're going into new countries, that will help minimize their risk, their reputational risk, and the relationship that they have with the communities in which they operate.
Fantastic. Well, we are out of time. Eugene, Philip, and I think there was one more, Liam. We're going to note your answers. I think we probably have your address. If not, make sure we do have it. And we will reply to you separately offline, because I don't want to let people be late for their next appointment. Hugely rich discussion. What a fabulous topic. Huge interest from the audience as well. And I think the group have underscored the complexity and the urgency of this topic. So core message from all: investors must push this, but also the companies themselves have a huge amount of responsibility as well. You can find out more on the ICOCA website, the Investor Alliance website, but also I think all of us are available on we're all on LinkedIn. So if you want to reach out to everybody, please do feel free to engage directly. And until the next time, thank you all very much for tuning in, and we look forward to continuing the discussion. So thank you very much.